Oh yes, so Photoshop has got 19 adjustment layers, and in this video, we're gonna take a look at every single one. Hey guys, you're watching Dansky, the place to be to develop your creative skills, and in this video we're going to go through all 19 of Photoshop's adjustment layers. Now these do just that. You can use these to make various adjustments to your images in Photoshop. You may have used them all, you may have used some, you may have never even heard of them and used none, but don't worry, in this video we're going to cover every single one. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Rightio, so we're now in Photoshop and you can see I've opened up an image. We have a subject holding a beautiful bouquet of flowers, a nice evening scene in the background as well. And I've picked this image because we've got some nice yellows and oranges in the background. We've got the reds and whites on the flowers, the black on her dress. We've got some shadows and highlights in the image, and all of these different colors and tones gives me a great opportunity to demonstrate each of these different adjustment layers, not only how they're different from one another, but how you can use them in your images in Photoshop. So let's take a look at the first one, solid color fills. Rightio, so first up we need the layers panel. If you don't see it for any reason, just go up to window and down to layers, and hopefully it should then appear. You can see mine has appeared here, and from the bottom of that layers panel, click on the adjustment icon. It's this one here. You've got a dark half and a light half in a circle, and we can create a new adjustment layer. And if I click on this, we get the list of all adjustment layers, and we're going to be covering these in this video. First of all, we're going to start at the top with solid color. So let's click on that, and you can see it adds this as a new adjustment layer here. And in this particular instance, it invites us to pick a color from the color picker. So we can scrub through the hue slider, pick a color that we're happy with, click OK, and we now have this here as a separate adjustment layer. We can turn this off and back on by clicking on the eye, or we can double click on the thumbnail to edit the effect of the adjustment layer. So we could pick a slightly different color, click OK, and all adjustment layers also come with a mask. So if you're familiar with masks, we could select something like the brush tool. We could pick black from the color picker, and anywhere that I brush will hide the adjustment layer and reveal the image underneath. If I pick white from the color picker instead and brush onto the mask, you can see it will show the adjustment layer again and hide the image underneath. And I can also just grab that layer mask, drag it to the trash, and it'll say, do you want to delete it? We'll say yes, and then we are still just left with the adjustment layer itself. Now, because this is a solid color, it is hiding our image. So what we can do to make this a bit more interesting is go to this drop down above, click on this, and pick a blending mode. Lots of cool effects here, and with Photoshop CC 2019 we also get the live preview, so you can see as I hover over each one I get a real-time preview of how that effect is going to look. It makes it much easier to find the one you want a lot quicker. So I'll go with overlay, and I can also adjust the opacity, so I could bring this down and it makes the effect more or less pronounced depending on what you're going for. So I could bring this up, make it a bit more vibrant, drop it down, make it less pronounced, and there we go. Okay, cool. So next up, we've got the gradient adjustment layer. Okay, so let's go down to the adjustment icon again. We'll click on gradient, and this time we get a slightly different pop-up. We can click here on the bar here, the drop down, and we can pick from one of the presets. We've even got rainbow here, which is pretty special. Or we could just click on the default black to white gradient, and then just double click on these swatches on the gradient slider, and we'll just pick our own swatches and make up a gradient. Now if you want to add another swatch, you just hover over here and click, and it will add a swatch, and you can click and drag it off and it will remove it. So let's add a few more colors. So remember, we just have to double click on a swatch and we can then go and edit it from the color picker. There we go, we've got a nice kind of pinky red to pink to purple. Beautiful, we can click OK. Now you can see at the moment we have a gradient that is linear, so it runs from one direction to another in a straight line, whether it's horizontal, vertical or diagonal. We can also select radial, which starts in the center and goes towards the edge. And we can also pick from some other ones here. And of course you get that real-time preview so you can see just how they're going to look. So we'll go back to linear And we can adjust the angle as well, so which direction our gradient is pointing. We can adjust the scale, so we could make it larger. This pretty much just looks like a solid color now. Or we could take it all the way down, and it makes that divide a little bit harsher between the different colors. So that essentially is how smooth your gradient will blend together. And you can choose to reverse the gradient with a single click, which is pretty handy. And then when you're happy, just click OK. And as with the solid color, we can of course use blending modes to blend this into our image in interesting ways. Yes, super interesting. And next up, we've got the pattern adjustment layer. Okay, so let's go to the adjustment icon once more, click and select pattern. And we'll get this pop-up window appear, and we can of course adjust the scale of our pattern. We have one here selected by default at the moment. So you can see increasing the scale makes the pattern a lot bigger. Depending on the pattern, it might pixelate if you scale it up too much, but these are some of Photoshop's default patterns, so they're doing a pretty good job, to be honest. Now you can check this box to link the pattern with your layer. So if you move the layer, the pattern will move with it, or you can click snap to origin and it will reset the position of the pattern. Now this is the fun part. We can click on this drop down over here and we get lots of patterns that we can click through. And I've got some custom ones that I've loaded up here as well, just to give you an idea of the kind of things that you can create. We've got some dots, some little lines, some squiggles, some texture. Oh, it's just beautiful. But what you can also do is click on the cog icon and you get a drop down. You can load any more patterns that you might find online or anything you download, load those custom patterns in here. But you also get these ones down here that come with Photoshop. So let's just click on, let's say, artistic surfaces, and it will say, do we want to replace the current patterns, that's this one here, with the patterns from artistic surfaces. So we can click OK and it will wipe this palette and just put only the artistic surfaces patterns in. Or we can click append, and what it does is add those to the bottom of the list. So we could just make this a bit larger from the bottom right corner, scale that up, and now we've got a whole bunch more of patterns. So all these different artistic surfaces. So of course I could pick one, scale it up. When I'm happy, click OK. And of course, again, use those blending modes to blend this through. And you can see that that texture, that pattern blends through onto the image. And I can adjust the opacity, bring it down so it's nice and subtle. And then you can see if I turn it off and back on, that pattern now blends through onto the image. Ah, super cool. Yes, indeed, super cool. Next up, we've got brightness and contrast. Okay, so we'll go to the adjustment icon, click and select brightness and contrast. And we can start by clicking on auto, and Photoshop will make its best guess of the brightness and contrast that is right for our image. If you do, however, disagree with Photoshop, how dare you? You can of course manually adjust the brightness yourself. So we could bring the slider down. You can see the image gets darker, drag it to the right, it gets brighter. And we can also adjust the contrast. So we can adjust this by sliding this along, and you can see that preview change in real time. So if I bring the contrast all the way up, the blacks get darker, the colors get more vibrant, more vivid, and more saturated. But with all of these adjustment layers, if you don't understand any particular one, just grab those sliders, drag them around, see how the preview changes in real time, and just have fun. And the more you play around with these different adjustment layers, the more you will understand how each one of these works. So yeah, just have a ton of fun and get super creative. But next up, we've got levels. Okay, so let's go down to the adjustment icon, click and select levels. Now I have some presets here at the top, and I can do things like increase the contrast, or maybe lighten the shadows, or I can just go back to the beginning and do it myself. So from the drop down here, we have RGB selected currently. This stands for red, green and blue. Every image that we see on screen is made up of those three channels, red, green and blue. So essentially by editing in this RGB channel, I'm going to be affecting the levels for the entire image and all of the colors within it. If I click on the drop down, I can choose the red, green and blue channel individually and adjust the channels for each of those levels respectively. However, I'm going to stay within RGB for the moment. And you can see here we have a histogram below, which maps out the levels, the highlights, the shadows and the midtones from our image. And of course, I can grab this little slider here And this is for the shadows. And if I bring this to the right, you can see it adjusts the strength of the shadows in the image. Very, very dark. On the right, we have highlights, so I can bring this in and you can see those highlights become really blown out and more pronounced. And then in the middle, I have the midtones, and this is somewhere in between the two. So of course I can move these around and then adjust that midpoint between the shadows and the highlights to get the desired effect. Or again, if I'm feeling lazy, I've got the auto option here. And down the very bottom, I also have the blacks and the whites. So if I bring this up, you can see there become fewer blacks in the image, or they become a lot lighter. And if I bring the whites in here, you can see the image becomes a lot darker. There we go, that was levels. Next up, we've got something similar, curves. Okay, so down to the adjustment icon, click and select curves. And you can see very similar to levels, we have some similar drop downs. We can choose a preset, slightly different preset, but presets nonetheless. We can choose a particular channel, or we can just work in all three, which is RGB. And we have the lazy person's auto option that does all the work for us. The main difference between levels and curves is that whereas levels go from left to right only horizontally, curves can go up and down. So I can click anywhere on this line to add a point, and I can drag it up or down as well. So we can go left, right with the sliders that you can see around the image, and up and down as well. So what you can create is much more extreme, but this is a much more advanced version of levels in my opinion. So you can see I created a point there. I can click and drag this off to remove it altogether. And down the bottom, I can adjust the shadows in the image by using the slider, and the highlights here by using the one on the opposite side. And then I can also click on these 2 points that are created by default at either end, and I can drag these up, and you can see it adjusts the blacks and the whites in the image that relate to this sidebar here. So it starts at black at the bottom and runs to white at the top. So you can see I can bring these down. It makes the image darker. So what I can do is I can move these all around, click and add points. In fact, I can add as many points as I like, and you can see that what I can create is pretty crazy as well. Now I could switch over to another mode here. I can click on this and I can draw my own curves line, which looks terrible, or I can switch back to this one and just manually create it by using these anchor points. And if it does all go horribly wrong, you've got that auto option there just to save you. Not that you need saving or anything, like you got this, you are awesome. And with that said, we're now going to take a look at exposure. Okay, you know the drill by now. Down to the adjustment icon, click and exposure. So of course we've got those presets that we can either select here or completely ignore. We'll ignore them and manually adjust the sliders ourselves. So we have the exposure slider at the top. This of course adjusts the exposure for the image, and you can see that it mostly controls the highlights. You can bring this up and it will brighten up the image, really increase those highlights, make them more pronounced. If I bring it too far, you can see it will really blow out the highlights on the image, and you can go quite extreme with this tool. In fact, with the exposure adjustment layer, you can make very small movements on these sliders to create quite dramatic results. So I'm not bringing it up that far, and already you can see that I'm kind of approaching that point where I don't want to go much further because I will start to lose some detail around the face and other areas in the image. So we'll go a slight adjustment on the exposure there. Now the offset slider, this controls mostly the shadows. So you can see if I bring this down even a tiny bit, the image gets considerably darker around the shadows in particular. I can bring this up and it looks like this, no shadows whatsoever, all the shadows here. So as I say, very slight movements do give quite dramatic results. And we've also got gamma correction below, which largely controls the midtones in the image. So I can adjust this here. You can see that preview changing in real time. But as with all these adjustment layers, if you don't know what anyone does or you don't understand anyone in particular, just adjust the sliders, have a play, see how the preview changes, and ultimately just have fun. Exactly, just have fun. And speaking of fun, next up we're going to take a look at Vibrance. Okay, down to the adjustment icon, click and Vibrance. Now this is a nice and easy one. We have the Vibrance slider at the top, which can do just that. It can make your image less vibrant, or a little bit more vibrant. Just enhances those colors, increases the saturation, just makes the colors in your image pop a little bit more. I like to think of Vibrance as a less extreme version of saturation, because if I drag the saturation slider below, you can see at 100 it becomes pretty extreme, and if I drag it all the way to the left, it will desaturate the entire image and essentially take all of the color out of it. So if I put saturation back to around about 0 and bring Vibrance all the way up to 100, you can see it still isn't as extreme as saturation, but sometimes a nice little lift of something like this just enables the colors to just become a little bit more vibrant. Next up, something similar to Vibrance, but again, slightly more advanced: hue and saturation. Okay, down to the adjustment icon, click and hue and saturation. Now we've got some presets here at the top. Of course we could select sepia, for example, and we get the desired effect, or we can just go back to default. Now by default, when you load up hue and saturation, master is selected. This is every color in the image, so any changes we make to these sliders below affects the entire image. However, we can click on the drop down, select a particular color, so yellows for example, and any adjustments we make with these sliders will only affect the yellows in the image. So you can see as I change that there. So let's go back and select master. And first up we've got hue. So this essentially cycles through all of the different colors, the hues, and it adjusts every color in the image respectively. This is one of those things that isn't particularly useful in this instance really, but it is perfect sometimes when you need to shift the hue of a particular color. And of course we have saturation that we had before. Drag it all the way to the left, desaturates the entire image, or you can saturate it more by dragging it to the right. You can see you can go quite extreme with this as well. And we have lightness, so we can drag this slider to the left, and essentially it makes the image darker or lighter. And we can also click on colorize. So this will remove the existing color from the image. And if we just bump up the saturation here, we can drag through the hue slider and it just applies a single color overlay to the entire image. And we can control the saturation of that color overlay, the lightness, and when we're happy, we can even go and apply a blending mode. And you can see with those real-time previews how that looks. Rightio, next up is one of my favorites. This is color balance. Okay, down to the adjustment icon again, and this time we're going to look at color balance. So here we can pick a particular tone from the image from this drop down. We have the shadows, midtones, and highlights. So if we go to the shadows first of all, the shadows in this image, of course, around the side of her face, around her hair, we have the dress here, the black dress with lots of shadows in the background. So there are lots and lots of shadows. And now we have shadows selected here. We can control the color of those shadows. So if I wanted to make the shadows a bit more blue, I can of course adjust the sliders here. And you can see it only affects these shadows in the image. If I then go to midtones, I can adjust the color of the midtones, and of course as I drag it towards a particular color with these sliders, it becomes more like that color. So if I wanted the highlights, for example, to be more blue, I just drag more towards cyan and more towards blue. If I wanted it to be more green, I drag it more towards green and maybe bring blue back down and more towards yellow. Obviously this is a very extreme example, but if I were to do something slightly less extreme, you can use this to make some really, really nice and subtle shifts in color to an image. So maybe I could do something like this. And if I turn this off and back on, you can see that's one way that you can use a color balance adjustment layer. And you can also use a color balance adjustment layer to take one image, another image, and color match them together. So pretty useful stuff. But next up, we're going to take a look at the black and white adjustment layer. Okay, once again, down to the adjustment icon, click black and white. And of course, we've got our presets here. We could go for maximum black, or let's say maximum white, and you get lots of different presets. We'll go back to default and maybe give our auto button a click. Now previously we just grabbed the saturation slider, dragged it to the left and it stripped out all the color from our image. Essentially this is a much more advanced and more effective way of creating black and white effects in Photoshop. So what I can do now is I can adjust how light or how dark each color in the original image is. So if I just go and turn this adjustment layer off for a moment, you can see I've got some red here in the flowers and there's specks of red all throughout most of this image, but mostly in the flowers here. So if I turn this back on, if I go down to the red slider and I adjust this, you can see any red that is present in the image is being adjusted in a black and white mode. So I could bring this all the way up and those red flowers become incredibly bright. Drag it down, they become incredibly dark. So essentially these sliders, depending on the colors that are in your image, enable you to fine tune a black and white effect that you are happy with. And of course we've also got the tint option up here, so we can check this box and pick a particular color tint, scrub through the hue slider and apply a particular color overlay to our image and click OK. And there we go. So it doesn't have to just be black and white. You can also use this to apply a tint. But if I just disable the tint, I can then keep this as a black and white adjustment layer, or I can go to the blending modes drop down and just blend this through onto the original image and you can get something like this. So there's a look at the black and white adjustment layer, and there's lots of different uses there beyond just settings for black and white. Now this next one is pretty useful for making subtle changes to photos. This is Photo Filter. Okay, so down to the adjustment icon, click and Photo Filter. So what this enables us to do is pick a particular color. So we have these three at the top here. These are filters that will warm up an image to kind of give it more of an orangey yellow kind of tone to it. Or we've got some cooling filters here that will be a bit more blue. They will kind of cool down your image, so you can adjust image temperature using these filters, and you can adjust the density here to make it more or less pronounced. But we've got some other colors down here as well. We've got sepia that we've seen in a few other adjustment panels. You can of course increase the sepia effect by adjusting the density. And we've also got some other ones. So Deep Emerald, for example, adds like a little bit of a green tint to it, but you can also check the color box and pick your own color from the color picker if you like. Click OK, and then adjust the density depending on how pronounced you would like that photo filter to be. Okay, next up, let's take a look at Channel Mixer. Okay, so let's go down to the adjustment icon, click and select Channel Mixer. And of course, we've got some presets at the top that we can use. And the output channel below, we can choose red, green or blue. So if I select red, you can see red is at 100% and the green and blue channels below are at 0. And the important thing to pay attention to is the total below, which is 100%. Now, in this panel, you want to try and avoid going too far above 100%, because when you get as close to 100% as you can, you tend to get the best color reproduction in your image and essentially get the most out of this layer. So if I bring the green up, for example, to 38, you can see the total is now 138, and I get this warning triangle that says the total is greater than 100. So I can go and adjust these, bring certain ones down, essentially mix these three channels together to try and get as close to 100 as I can, and I just get a much more balanced result. So if I hover over one of these, you can see what it does. This modifies the influence of the red channel within the overall mix. So for example, I could go to the output channel now, go down to blue, and I could start making some adjustments to this, and you can see how the color changes. And we've also got the constant down here as well. This slider adjusts the brightness of the result and is saved to the output channel. So it's saved to this particular channel. So I could go and adjust this, and you can see how it changes that image. I could maybe switch to another channel and make some changes there so you get the desired effect. And as with all of these adjustment layers, if in doubt, just play around with the sliders, have fun, see the preview change in real time until you get something you're happy with. And then you can even go to the channel mixer adjustment layer, and from the blending modes drop down, go and pick a blending mode and get even more creative. Rightio, next up, let's take a look at color lookup. Okay, down to the adjustment icon, click and color lookup. And we can get a profile from a few different places here. I'm going to click this one, load 3D LUT, and I can navigate to a LUT if I've got one. LUT, L-U-T, stands for lookup table. So essentially this is a color lookup table, and I can click on this drop down, and there's lots of presets here that come with Photoshop. A lot of these are very similar to what you get in something like Premiere Pro and that are used for video. And think of it as like a color preset. So I can click on Foggy Night and it just applies that color profile. So let's pick a few more. We've got Futuristic Bleak, Horror Blue. Let's find another one. Tension Green, fantastic. So essentially you can see it's like just using a color profile preset and very similar to using LUTs in something like video when doing color grading. Rightio, next up we have Invert. Okay, so let's go down to the adjustment icon, click and select Invert. And yeah, basically this just inverts the color in the image. So, I mean, you could go to the blending options and try and blend this into the image in an interesting way, I guess, but yeah. So Invert can be incredibly useful, but the adjustment layer itself just doesn't have any settings as such. But this next one is pretty interesting. This is Posterize. Okay, so let's go down to the adjustment icon, click and select Posterize. And we get a slider here for levels. We can click and drag this, but if we drag too far to the right, it doesn't really make any changes with this image that I'm using. So I'll leave this at the left. In fact, I prefer to click in the box on the value and then use the up and down arrow keys on my keyboard to adjust the levels. So to increase and decrease that, it's a little bit more gradual and a bit more precise than using the slider. And of course we can't go lower than 2 levels. Now with this Posterize adjustment layer, we have our image, it's RGB, made up of 3 channels. We have the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel. Now currently we have our levels set to 2, so that's 2 levels per channel. So in this preview here, we're seeing an image with about 6 colors. So Photoshop tries to take all of that color information and match it as closely as it can, depending on the number of levels that we are allowing with this particular effect. So as I say, if I increase the number of levels now using the arrow keys on my keyboard, you can see that as I increase the number of levels I'm allowing, Photoshop will bring in more and more color and more detail from the original image. In fact, it gets to the point where you increase the levels so much that it's bringing in exactly the same amount of information as in the original photo. So as you get so far through the levels slider, it actually doesn't make any difference. But of course, when you're back down here, it looks pretty interesting. And indeed it does. Next, let's take a look at Threshold. Okay, so let's go down to the adjustment icon, click and select Threshold. And you can see I can adjust the slider here and I get a preview in real time. And what this does is essentially make everything affected by this adjustment layer black and white, but you could control how much of that detail is brought through. Now you can do this with the slider, or you can click here in the threshold level box and enter a specific value and press return if you like. So we want to try and retain some of the detail around the face. If I drag this too low, you can see it starts to become a bit lost. But the main problem I've got with this image is that the subject in the background is just, there's not enough contrast and it's all just blurring together. So some images might work better than others, but what I'm going to do is right click on this layer and select delete layer. And in the latest version of Photoshop, I can go to select and down to subject. And this is a really quick way of doing it. Photoshop will make a selection of the subject and I can go back to the adjustment icon, click and select threshold again. And now when I make any changes, I'm literally just doing the subject on her own. So I can do one for the subject, and then I might do one for just the background, for example. And then I can balance the threshold of the subject and the background separately and just find a balance that works. Or I could just keep the subject in this black and white effect, leave the background as it is, and then go to a blending mode and just see how this looks if I were to blend this threshold adjustment layer into the original image. Okay, so this next one is probably my favorite adjustment layer. It's super creative and it's called a gradient map. Okay, so let's go to the adjustment icon, click, and gradient map. This is definitely one of my favorites. What this enables me to do is click on the gradient slider and map a gradient to the whites and the blacks in the image. So if I double click on this color here, I can go and pick like a tealy, turquoisey, minty green kind of color, and I'll double click on this swatch here and then map like a purple or something. I can go and add more colors, but I find some of the best ones that create something a little bit like a duotone effect is when using two colors, and you get a nice smooth gradient in between. So you can see this is how it looks. I can click OK, and then I can also click and reverse it, and then you get something like this. So when using a gradient with two colors, you always get one that makes it look as though the image is inverted, and then one that makes it look more like the image. But this is something that I absolutely love, and we can even go and add more colors. I'll show you just how it looks. If we go and add another random color, we could add something totally bonkers. And you can see some of the effects that you can create with the gradient map adjustment layer are pretty creative. And last, but by no means least, let's take a look at Selective Color. Okay, so let's go down to the adjustment icon and click and choose the last option, Selective Color. This is our last adjustment layer. This is similar to the hue and saturation adjustment layer, but slightly different. So whereas before we were able to select these top 6 here, we can now choose to modify the whites, the neutrals, and the blacks. And the main difference is now that our sliders don't adjust hue, saturation, and lightness, but cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So we're currently targeting the blacks, and we can adjust the amount of cyan in the blacks. So you can see all the blacks in the image just become a bit more bluer, more towards the color cyan. And I could maybe select the reds, for example, and increase the magenta, and you can see it kind of adds a bit more of a pinky tone reminiscent of the color magenta. So this is like being able to adjust the colors in the hue and saturation adjustment layer, but this is much more advanced and you get a bit more control over the colors you can pick and the types of colors that you can change those colors to using these specific sliders. And as I've mentioned throughout this entire video, if in doubt, just select all manner of craziness with these sliders until you get something bonkers, and then go and pick a blending mode and just cross your fingers and yeah, see what you get. It's a ton of fun and it can be incredibly creative as well. And there we go, there's a look at all 19 of Photoshop's adjustment layers. Guys, I really hope you found this tutorial helpful. If you've got any questions or comments, please do drop them down below. But as always, like this video if you enjoyed it. Take care and I'll see you next time.